Welcome to a brand new episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. My name is Eric, and I'm your host for today's show. This podcast stems from our popular blog at paperbackwarrior.com, where you can find loads of reviews, articles, 96 episodes of this very show, and links galore to buy all of these exciting books we chat about. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Pinterest, and be sure to like us. You can donate to the show on our blog's desktop version, just up in the top right-hand corner. Just remember, we aren't protected by a paywall, and we always want to remain free of charge, but your tips in the old tip jar can help pay our expenses. Today's episode features a detailed look at one of Robert E. Howard's famed characters, Kull, sometimes referred to as King Kull, Kull the Conqueror, or Kull of Atlantis. Goes by a few different names. I'm going to be reviewing the King Kull Lancer paperback and several of Howard's short stories featuring Kull. We're going to touch on Robert E. Howard's life, some Conan references, and just have a grand old time with this pulpy adventure series. Tom is going to be reviewing a 1962 hard-boiled private eye mystery called Chem by one of his favorite authors, Robert Colby. Now, today's show was supposed to be broadcast live from Chicago's Windy City Pulp and Paper Con with my co-host Tom. We built the show up for that event, and we advertised it online that we were going to be attending, and man, we were just so close to all that coming together quite nicely. And here's how it went down in reality. Tom and I live in the same city here in Florida, so we travel out of the same airport. And we both arrived at the airport for our flight, and we even had dinner together at the airport. And let me just say, Tom has some serious clout with the airlines. He flashed like this secret decoder ring or something. And the next thing I know, we're in like this jazzy little airport lounge being treated like gods with wine and cheese. It didn't cost us a dime, so I'm just going to tell you, Tom flies in grand style. But both of our flights were going to go out around the same time, I think like 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, something. But he just happened to book a different flight than what I had booked. So he gets off the tarmac fine. He arrives in Chicago safe and sound. My flight, which I had booked with United, was delayed for like 15 minutes. And then I'm sitting there, and then it's 30 minutes. Then I'm sitting there, and it's like 45 minutes, and I'm getting kind of antsy. Before I know it, my flight has moved from 6 o'clock p.m. to never getting off the ground, which is like the worst time, right? The situation was that I had all the recording equipment in my bag, and there was no more flights to Chicago for that night. And I checked the schedule, and, honestly, the closest I could come to arriving in Chicago would be flying up to New Jersey, having a layover there in Newark, and then just Newark's in New Jersey, right? Yeah, I think so. Maybe it's Newark, Delaware. I can't remember. Newark, New Jersey, I think. I would have gotten into that convention like 4 hours prior to the show's broadcast, and then just essentially flying back home in like 15 hours. Just don't think that was the greatest way to spend my paycheck. So my deepest apologies to all of you, our fans, readers, listeners. Maybe we can make it work out as a live broadcast next year, maybe in Chicago at this same convention or somewhere else. But the great news is that Tom was able to attend the convention. And again, this was the Windy City Pulp and Paper Con in Lombard, Illinois, which is just west of Chicago. Tom was there chatting it up with all the sellers and the representatives of the indie publishers. From what he told me, his wallet showed up as well. So, but the bad news is that Tom and I just couldn't make our schedules pair up for this particular episode, though. He's a busy real-life private detective. That's right, Tom is a real-life private detective. And I'm just incredibly busy doing the whole family thing and dental appointments, doctor's appointments, homework, and all that fun stuff. So hopefully we're going to get together for the next episode. It's kind of a shame. We both live in the same town, and we're just miles apart, but in terms of schedules, we just can't make it work for some reason. But we'll get together hopefully on the next episode. So with that being said, I'm going to play an audio file that Tom sent me of his Windy City Pulp and Paper Con experience. It's about 8 minutes long, and I know you're going to love this. So here's Tom to talk about the convention.
Hello, Paperback Warrior listeners. This is Tom with a recap of the Windy City Pulp and Paper Convention that I attended. Anyway, so I arrived Friday night to the Westin Hotel in Lombard, Illinois, to the news that Eric's flight was canceled, and thus our podcast recording session in front of a live studio audience also wasn't going to happen. Anyway, after checking into the hotel, I went down to the auction room where the conventioneers were auctioning off old pulps and rare books on consignment to convention attendees. And that was my first glance at the crowd this year, and it was about what I expected. It was older men in their 60s and 70s who had a love for classic pulp fiction. By that I mean mostly the magazines from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, but there were certainly some vintage paperback enthusiasts among them. But I'd say for the auction, the pulps were the real focus. I mostly lurked in the back of the room and watched the auctions unfold. Most of the pulp magazines there were going for between $100 and $500, and there was an abundance of titles involving Robert E. Howard, who authored the Conan series, as well as Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote the Tarzan series. At least they were the ones that seemed to be getting top dollar while I was there. The highest dollar amount spent on any one item that I saw was $9,500 for a rare Robert E. Howard hardcover. Now, on Saturday morning, the convention floor opened at 10 o'clock, and the convention itself it's really mostly one big dealer's room about the size of maybe two large high school gymnasiums with row after row of folding tables with white tablecloths on them where the vendors were selling their stuff. Now, the first kind of vendor, and probably the most common, were selling pulp magazines. Now, some of these were professional dealers or collectors who were just trying to unload parts of their collection. Others were clearly trying to buy low and sell high. To the naked eye, it looked very much like a comic book convention because they had the white comic book boxes in like endless displays of row after row. But if you looked inside the boxes, you saw bagged and boarded pulp magazines rather than comic books. I quickly learned that in the pulp magazine community, the condition of the magazine is everything. There were dealers there selling pulps in terrible condition for $5 or $10 for people like me who really only care about reading the stories. However, the good condition or somewhat good condition collectible ones that were in the bags and boards commanded dozens, if not hundreds or even thousands of dollars. The second category were people selling new books, mostly glossy trade paperbacks. These included reprint houses like our friends at Bold Venture Press, who were selling these beautifully packaged reprints of old pulp and paperback vintage novels. However, there are also several new book publishers selling what they called new pulp, consisting of authors who were basically writing contemporary novels in the old pulp tradition and style. For example, author Will Murray had a table at the convention selling his novels starring Tarzan, the Shadow, Doc Savage, the Spider, and others. They were among the most beautifully packaged books at the convention, and they were written by a guy who really knows the characters and the writing style probably better than anyone alive. There were also dealers selling original pulp and vintage paperback art. These original art pieces were going for top dollar, hundreds if not thousands of dollars. The smart vendors had actual copies of the books and pulps that the art appeared in, and it was kind of cool seeing like an old paperback propped up against the giant framed work of art that was created for that book's cover. Of course, the best and most important vendors are the ones who were selling vintage paperback books. The rule of thumb at conventions is that the vendors generally bring their most expensive items to the conventions. It's generally just not worth their time to transport a bunch of $1 books across the country to sell to bottom feeder cheapskates like me. However, this convention seemed to have a lot of cheap paperback books for sale. Most were in their plastic bags. All of the vendors were prepared to haggle with me as I made offers on stacks and stacks of books while I was there. There was only one vendor that I can recall who was selling paperback books at top dollar, and I understood his position because his inventory was outstanding. They were in beautiful condition and priced between, let's say, $10 and $40 per book. I bought a few from him, and he was an easy guy to get along with, and I was able to haggle with him successfully. My haul from the convention, the books I bought, was just too big to detail here, but I want to give you three highlights. First was a book called Triple Cross. The author's name is John Robert. He wrote a book that some of you may recall called Tough Cop that I reviewed on the site. I don't remember loving the book, but I remember it being good enough. The paperback Triple Cross is a reprint of a mystery from 1946 starring a short-lived series character named Jigger Moran, who's a disbarred attorney acting as a private investigator without a license. My impression from the description is that Moran comfortably straddles both sides of the law to get things done. The second book I want to feature is No Entry by Manning Coles. Now, Manning Coles is one of those author names that I see around in used bookstores, but I didn't really know what to make of him or her. Turns out that Manning Coles is a pseudonym of two authors, Adelaide Manning and Cyril Coles. I think they're British. The fictional protagonist of the 26 books in the series stars Thomas Hambledon. He's a British spy with MI5. This particular one, No Entry, is from 1958, and it's the 21st book in the series. The protagonist needs to sneak into East Germany to recover a university student who vanished there behind the wire. He's got secrets to provide to the Russians if he doesn't get rescued, etc. Anyway, the book's called No Entry by Manning Coles. It looks great. The third book I want to tell you about is actually the one I'm most excited about reading. It's called Cry Flood by Ernest Jason Fredericks. It's a paperback from 1959. The author is actually a Chicago guy by the name of Paul Ernst, who also wrote many of the Avenger novels under the Kenneth Robeson house name. Anyway, Cry Flood is about a group of people forced to take refuge in a diner during a hurricane, and then drama and skullduggery unfolds. It reminds me a little bit, in the description at least, like Stephen King's The Mist, where a bunch of volatile people are trapped inside a small commercial space while all hell is breaking loose outside. Again, the book's called Cry Flood by Ernest Jason Fredericks. Anyway, walking the convention floor, I was stopped by many people who are fans of the podcast and the Paperback Warrior blog, and it was nice to have so many conversations with these people. Many of the people I met were looking forward to seeing Eric and I perform the live recording of the podcast at the convention, and I had to break it to them gently that the recording was just not going to happen. I have to say that they were all incredibly gracious and understanding with the world of flight cancellations. I guess my only critique of the convention is that it's really just a big dealer's room unless you want to go into the movie room and watch old movies. As a result, I was pretty bored after walking around for 5 or 6 hours looking into every dealer there in great detail and making my purchases. I ended up moving my Sunday afternoon flight to early Sunday morning because I felt that I had sort of done everything I needed to do on Saturday. It wasn't like there was more inventory coming onto the convention floor that hadn't been there all along. Overall, I'd say if you've never been to a pulp and paper convention, I highly recommend it. This Windy City one was about the best we have in the United States, and if you happen to be in Chicago for any reason, coinciding with the convention in May, you should definitely check it out. Otherwise, it's really just a question of how much you want to spend getting to the convention for the right to buy old paperbacks. The overhead cost of your flight and hotel ends up drastically increasing the average cost of each book. Trust me, I've done the math. Anyway, it was a good convention, but ultimately it was no financial bargain for me. I'm going to catch you guys later in the show for a book review, and back to you, Eric.
That was a lot of fun listening to Tom's experience there, and he and I were texting just a little bit back and forth while he was there, and just looking at the photos and things, and man, there was a lot of stuff that I probably would have ended up buying, but I probably would have needed to mail the stuff back since it probably wouldn't fit all in my suitcase, but thankfully, I still gained some new books while I was staying at home here in Florida. I received an awesome package of goodies from our good friends here at Bold Venture Press. They're an indie publisher in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, just south of me. So good friends Rich and Audrey, they run Bold Venture Press, and here's what I received from them in the mail. The first is a collection called Murders Macabre by an author named Norman Firth. I'm not familiar with this author. The collection includes 3 novelettes: Terror Stalks the Night, Phantom of the Charnel House, and The Devil in Her. These all sound pretty morbid, right? Terrifying. There's also an introduction about the author and his life, which is just fascinating. Firth was a British author born in 1920. Unfortunately, he died at the age of 29 with tuberculosis. But during his short career, he wrote short stories for many of the magazines like Stag and Galaxy. He specialized in a lot of different genres like action, western, crime fiction. He also authored some novels as well. When I Shall Sleep Again, The Proud Castle, and I think a couple others. This particular collection is offered by Bold Venture Press as a spotlight on Firth's Gothic stories, and these are in the vein of the weird menace or weird terror pulp mags, like for example, thrilling mystery stories. I'm looking forward to reading this. It just looks fantastic, and it also has these cool retro-styled black and white drawings as the covers for each story in the book. The book is right at 200 pages, and the price on the back here, it shows $12. So again, Murders Macabre, author Norman Firth, $12, 200 pages, 3 novelettes, Bold Venture Press. Great stuff. I'm going to look forward to reading this, and I'll get you my review. I also received from them Masked Rider Western number 7. And I'm glad I got this because I keep seeing these advertised on their website and on Facebook, and I'm just not really sure what that's about. So I'm glad that I was able to get a copy and kind of thumb through it. It's beautiful. It's a throwback to the original Masked Rider Western pulp published by I think this is Better Publications. Somewhere between 1934 and 1953, I think, is when they were publishing this pulp. The Masked Rider is this mysterious masked hero that's aided by his friend Blue Hawk to oppose lawless men when, I guess, hanging is just too darn good for them. This book that Bold Venture Press sent to me and has published is the 7th installment, and it features an original novel starring the Masked Rider called Iron Horse Gunsmoke. Author's name is Donald Bain Hobart, and it turns out he wrote about 20 Masked Rider stories in total, and he also contributed to the detective mags as well, so he was fairly prolific. This book also includes 2 non-Masked Rider stories as well. That Bond of Courage by George H. Michener, and Roaring Verdict by a guy named Tom Gunn with 2 N's. So for $13, you get a novel with illustrations, 2 additional stories. It's awesome, and I'm really going to enjoy reading and reviewing this. Again, Masked Rider Western number 7, out now through Bold Venture Press. I also received an original Zorro novel by an author named Susan Kite. I've been curious about this book, and again, I've seen it advertised on Bold Venture's website and on social media. The deal is that Susan Kite has authored a 3-book trilogy, an original trilogy called Zorro's Pacific Odyssey. This is a new series, all of which are, of course, published by Bold Venture Press. This first installment that I received is called Zorro and the Outward Journey. This sort of sets up the trilogy. The synopsis is that Don Diego de la Vega, the rich guy that, puts the mask and cloak on and becomes Zorro, he's taken hostage aboard this British ship where he must orchestrate an escape from this, brutal captain and, nefarious crew, I guess. I love the idea of this, and I've thumbed through it a little bit, and it looks fantastic. I love nautical stories, and I really liked the very first Zorro story from the pulps, which Bold Venture Press has reprinted as well. So it's sort of a marriage made in heaven. It's a beautiful trade paperback, just a little over 200 pages, and retail on the back shows $15. So brand new Zorro trilogy. This one's the first entry. Zorro's Pacific Odyssey, out now by Bold Venture Press. Looks great. I'm going to read it. I'll get you my review. Again, all these books that I'm mentioning are out on Bold Venture Press, and I know that Rich and Audrey, they're just a winning pair, and they always publish top-notch stuff. So I'm really excited about what they've done and what they're doing. So moving into today's feature. So how about sword and sorcery? Maybe a little muscle and brawn bravado. That's what I'm going to key up today on our feature on Kull by Robert E. Howard. So here's some tunes to kick us off. Today's feature is just a little bit different from what we normally cover here at Paperback Warrior. Our features are normally, like crime fiction authors or tips for shopping, collecting, reading vintage fiction. But sword and sorcery and fantasy are genres we've really just tipped our toes in. We haven't reached the deep end of those genres. I've covered a handful of Conan novels by Robert E. Howard. Other guys like Steve Perry, Sean Moore, Harry Turtledove, Lynn Carter. And you can find all those on the desktop version of the blog, right-hand column under Conan or fantasy, or maybe even some of those author names as well. My experience with the fantasy genre prior to Paperback Warrior was just a bunch of Drizzt the Elf books that were great by R.A. Salvatore. And I think I read some of the Red Sonja comics and Conan comics that were out through Dark Horse, and some of those graphic novels, which were great. They looked good, and they were just really good stories. But Tom recently read and enjoyed and reviewed the 1984 novel Legend by David Gemmell for this blog. So you can find it under the fantasy tag on the right for that Legend review. And he seemed like he really liked that book. But I do want to learn more about the sword and sorcery and even the sword and planet genres. So I figure Robert E. Howard is one of the best places to start. Today's feature isn't really on Robert E. Howard because that needs to be an entire feature dedicated just his life. But today's feature is on his character Kull. Kull is Kull, which predates his most popular and influential character of Conan. That's what he's really known for, is Conan, but this was before Conan. So what do you need to know about Robert E. Howard is that he was born in 1906, and he unfortunately committed suicide in 1936. Tragic life, just a really tragic guy. He spent the majority of his life in a small Texas town called Cross Plains. He discovered the pulp magazines in his early teen years, and in 1924, at the age of 18, he finally sold a short story to a new fantasy and horror pulp magazine called Weird Tales. We've all heard of that, right? It had just launched the first issue the year before. So that magazine, as many of us know, is iconic, features authors like H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Ray Bradbury, early Robert Bloch, E. Hoffman Price, just to name some of the early ones. The last I heard, that magazine is still going on. I think it's up to like issue 360-something. It may be digital now at this point. So after Weird Tales bought Howard's first story in 1924, he started contributing a lot of poetry and then additional short stories. In 1926, Howard began making history, although he didn't really know it at the time, by partially writing a novelette that would become The Shadow Kingdom a year later in 1927. The Shadow Kingdom is the first sword and sorcery literary work in America, and it's considered one of the earliest examples of the genre. According to author Lynn Carter's article called Chronicles of the Sword, featured in The Savage Sword of Conan No. 2 from 1974, Carter says the closest thing to sword and sorcery prior to Howard's The Shadow Kingdom is probably the 1905 book of fabled stories called The Gods of Pagana by Norman Irish soldier, playwright, and poet Lord Dunsany. Even Carter suggests that Dunsany's writing was sort of dreamy, didn't really have any major influence on what would become later sword and sorcery, but he created a number of solid fantasy stories featuring warriors and dragons and so forth. Arguably, these could be the prototype of what was to become later with traditional sword and sorcery, but according to Lynn Carter, Robert E. Howard brought a much stronger sense of realism to his settings than any of the predecessors before him. They seem to take like a romantic view of the heroism and the settings and things like that, where Robert E. Howard sort of stripped that away and took a much, much grimmer approach to it. So Robert E. Howard's The Shadow Kingdom is also the first story that Howard wrote that features this hero, King Kull. It's basically the blueprint that Howard would use to create the legendary Conan character later. The Shadow Kingdom was published in August 1929 by Weird Tales. Only 2 Kull short stories would be published in Howard's lifetime. Isn't that crazy? Just 2 Kull short stories published while he was alive. But we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So who is this Kull fellow? What's his deal? In Howard's story, Black Abyss, Kull is physically described as towering like a heroic statue, mighty, broad-shouldered, bull-chested, draped in gorgeous robes of scarlet and purple. He has a flowing cloak of silver cloth, gems on his fingers, gold armlet, sword and girdle, square, cut, black hair, and green eyes. So he's physically daunting, right? So Kull lives in the fictional universe as Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian. Only instead of the Hyborian Age, which is Conan's era, Kull lives in a much earlier time period than that, known as the Thurian Age. So Kull before Conan, both fictionally and chronologically. So Kull's brief history is presented in a very short story written by Howard that was originally untitled. Then later, it was titled To Exile of Atlantis. Now, in it, this young adult Kull lives in Atlantis, and he's out hunting with some older warriors and tribesmen. And this older, wise guy is explaining to Kull how the striped tigers worship the moon and are provided safety by it. And Kull, sort of wiser than his years, just bluntly tells them that he doesn't believe any of that nonsense. Like he just kind of is really just mocking their entire religion. A tiger, wouldn't worship the moon. He basically tells them they are believing in old mythology and that none of this nonsense is actually true. The passage is so powerful because it outlines Kull's independence and sort of his alternative views of his own culture. Also, as a precursor to Kull's future as a king, later that night he has a dream where the crowd is chanting King Kull. They're chanting his name. The next day, when this hunting group arrives back in Atlantis, they discover that a young woman has been tied to the stake and is about to burn. She sort of is like a witch in Salem. Her crime, unfortunately, was just falling in love with a member of a rival tribe, a Lemurian pirate. Now, Kull feels sympathy for her, and he defies the rules of his tribe, and instead of just cruelly watching her burn alive, he acknowledges to her with his eyes that he's going to quickly end her life so she doesn't have to burn. So, providing mercy, he quickly throws a dagger right into her heart, killing her instantly. He then becomes the exile of Atlantis and is forced to leave the tribe. The story ends with Kull fleeing his pursuers up this really tall cliff, and Kull leaves Atlantis. He's out on his own. He's now a nomad, a journeyman. He's gone. Again, this story is called Exile of Atlantis. It's been reprinted numerous times, but originally it was published in the 1967 Lancer paperback, King Kull, which I'm going to be reviewing as we go through the rest of this feature. The story was also adapted by talented scribe Roy Thomas and featured in the Savage Sword of Conan's third issue, December 1974, with awesome artwork by Barry Windsor Smith. In that same King Kull paperback, author Lynn Carter adds a paragraph after Exile of Atlantis that sort of fills in a gap. It explains that Kull was later captured by the Lemurians and was forced into slavery on a ship for 2 years. He then arrives in Volusia, where he becomes captured, forced into the dungeons, where he eventually becomes a gladiator, a soldier. He rises up into the ranks as a commander, and with mercenaries, he's able to kill Volusia's king, which is King Borna, and, quote, rips the crown off of his gory head and then sits up on the throne. Thus, King Kull is born. This is also documented in Howard's Kull short story, By This Axe I Rule. So back to August 1929, Weird Tales magazine, Howard's first Kull story he wrote, The Shadow Kingdom. Now, this story for sword and sorcery fans is essentially what the book of Genesis would be for Christians. It's the first, it's the most celebrated. In the Shadow Kingdom, supporting characters are introduced that are going to appear later in Kull short stories. The first is Canu. He's a Pictish ambassador. He's peaceful to Kull's kingdom of Volusia, but being from his country, being a Pictish, he's like sworn enemies of Atlantis. So he has to sort of make amends the fact that Kull, being the king of Volusia, was originally from Atlantis. Kull is invited to have a feast with Canu, where he's warned that a Pictish warrior named Brule the Spear Slayer is going to appear before Kull at sunset. So Kull gets the message, travels back to his palace, back to his throne, and awaits, and sure enough, Brule the Spear Slayer appears to him. And Brule reveals to Kull that there's secret passageways in Kull's own palace that he isn't even aware of. Further, Brule shows Kull that serpent men are secretly disguising themselves as palace guards, and that the real palace guards are all knocked unconscious and their bodies are hidden. So the story features just like this furious fighting scene in the palace. There's a dose of magic as this imposter Kull is revealed, and Volusia Counselor 2 is involved as well. These serpent men become Kull's enemy, although they never appear again in any future stories, which is kind of unfortunate. But this is just a great story, full of action. It moves along quickly, and I even read the story 3 times because I loved it so much. Also, these serpent men, reptiles pretending to be humans, it reminds me of an old television show from the 80s. Can you guess which one? I'm going to give you a second. Like, TV show, 1980s, reptilian aliens disguised as humans. That show was V, and man, that show terrified me. I remember watching it with my parents when it debuted, that miniseries on NBC, and when I think the female alien, one of the main characters, eats that rat, I was just it just totally creeped me out. I was terrified. So the only other Kull story that was published in Howard's lifetime was Mirrors of Tsoon Thune. It was published the following month in September 1929 in Weird Tales. Howard wrote 12 total Kull manuscripts and 1 poem, but again, all of these were rejected other than those 2 stories. Howard submitted a Kull story called By This Axe I Rule to both the magazines Argosy and Adventure in 1929, but it was rejected. Howard rewrote it as the Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword, which was published in December 1932. Due to the Kull rejections, Howard decided that he would just be better off concentrating his efforts on a character that Weird Tales would really like. So he created the Solomon Kane character and featured him in the story Red Shadows. It was published in August 1928, which led to 6 more Solomon Kane stories, all published by Weird Tales up until 1932. Kane, for whatever reason, was just more successful than Kull at the time. And like Conan, the Solomon Kane series would really probably be better off just getting its own feature right here on the podcast. I'd really like to delve into that series. I haven't read it, and I hear it's great. But let's leap to 1946, an Arkham House volume called Skullface and Others. And that volume featured The Mirrors of Tsoon Thune and The Silent Kingdom, which were both published during Howard's lifetime. And it also features the poem The King and the Oak. Other than this rather limited publication, these Kull stories just simply disappeared. Kind of reminds me of what happened with Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan series. I think for decades, those stories just disappeared. Either you had them in the pulp magazines and maybe in the hardcover, but they just disappeared. So in 1966, Glenn Lord, who was the literary agent for the Robert E. Howard estate, he locates 6 cartons of the author's papers, including a lot of unpublished manuscripts, carbons, and early drafts. Among the cartons were 7 complete, previously unpublished Kull stories, plus 3 unfinished stories. So Glenn Lord then goes back to work compiling all of these stories into an omnibus for the publisher Lancer. Now, Lancer was already reprinting the Conan stories as gorgeous paperbacks, including a lot of unfinished drafts and Conan stories that were completed by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter. So it only made sense for Lancer to just do the same thing for Kull that they were doing for Conan. So the first printing occurred in 1967 under the title King Kull, with just gorgeous cover art by artist Roy Crinkle. The paperback included all 12 Kull stories plus the poem, 3 of which were completed by Lynn Carter based on Howard's unfinished manuscripts. The stories were Wizard and Warrior, Riders Beyond the Sunrise, and Black Abyss. Now, minor edits were also made to some of the other stories by both Carter and Glenn Lord, maybe changing some character names and things like that just to avoid confusion. Spear Books reprinted the paperback in 1976, then Bantam reprinted it again in 1978 as Kull minus Lynn Carter's edits. Donald M. Grant reprinted the novel in 1985, once again titled Kull without Carter's edits. In 1995, Baen Books, Baen, released paperback as Kull with Carter's edits removed and an extra story added called The Curse of Golden Skull. And then finally, in 2006, a trade paperback was published by Del Rey called Kull, Exile of Atlantis. All this information I found in Glenn Lord's article, An Atlantean in Aquilonia, in Savage Sword of Conan #1, and also in Lynn Carter's article, Chronicles of the Sword, which I mentioned earlier. I'd like to now move into my book review for this episode, which is this 1967 Lancer paperback, King Kull. Again, this collects all of the Kull stories into one complete volume. So if you want to read Kull, this is the book to own. Some fans dislike the fact that Lynn Carter completed Howard's 3 unfinished Kull manuscripts, but I think he did it in Howard's style, which was really good. I don't think it's necessarily an insult when an artist does that. Howard purists really despise the fact that Carter and L. Sprague de Camp have taken liberties to complete unfinished manuscripts by Robert E. Howard. In this case, Carter finished 3 manuscripts, and either he titled these stories or Lancer did. I'm not sure which, because you got to remember these were unfinished manuscripts, didn't have titles. The 3 stories, again, that he completed were Black Abyss, which Howard originally had noted that it was going to be called Black City. The second is Riders Beyond the Sunrise, and the third is Wizard and Warrior. Carter also made some minor edits, as I mentioned earlier, to The Striking of the Gong and the story The Skull of Silence. What was really cool is Carter, he was really into this, man. He was really, really into Robert E. Howard's work. So Carter drew a really handy map that's featured at the very beginning of the book. So in this King Kull paperback, we already discussed the first 2 stories, Exile of Atlantis and The Silent Kingdom. So I wanted to highlight just a few other stories for you as well. I really love the story Black Abyss. It's about one of Brule the Spear Slayer's fellow warriors, a guy named Grogar, and he's kind of just hanging out, sort of leaning against the wall, and he just disappears into the wall. So Brule quickly notifies Kull, and the two enter this secret doorway into like this dark passage. And inside they find just like this dark wizardry as Grogar has been tortured and strapped to an altar. So when Kull attempts to free him, this giant, slithering, devilish worm enters, and the story turns into this action-packed horror story. It was just so descriptive and so dark, and I really love the ending, which I assume is credit to Carter's storytelling. There's also this really, really terrifying Pied Piper in the story, too, and it was just so creepy. The Skull of Silence was another really dark and scary story. Kull and his companions travel to what is essentially a haunted house. It's rumored to be haunted, and it's kind of like, in that neighborhood, it's like one of those houses that's abandoned, and everybody, rides their bicycle by and just, stares at it thinking it's a haunted house. They sort of dare Kull to go to this haunted house. So Kull shows up and discovers that there's this horrific cosmic entity inside the house that can only be defeated by sound. It's got, got the H.P. Lovecraft influences on that story. The other one was Del Carty's Cat, and it's one of the longest stories, and it has Kull in the depths of Volusia's Forbidden Lake. And there he faces this gigantic octopus type creature. He fights a 4-armed shark dude, I don't really know what else to call it, and a giant sea serpent. And this story features the first appearance of an evil wizard named Thulsa Doom. And this villain will show up repeatedly in Howard's stories, even the Conan stories and the Cormac McArt stories as well. And he also shows up in the Kull comic books, too. The story I favored the most is By Axe I Rule, which is just a furious bloodbath as Kull's forced to fight 20 assassins in his palace. Hoping to shift the momentum of the fight, he grabs a broadaxe from the wall and just goes to town. The story also has Kull destroying all of the old laws with the axe and then just simply bellowing, "I am the law." And it reminded me of the British comic hero Judge Dredd. So what's interesting about By Axe I Rule is that it was originally submitted to the magazines, but was just rejected for some reason. I don't really know why. It's a great, great story. But as I mentioned earlier, Howard later would just change out Kull with Conan, and then he made a few other revisions. He also added some magic, and honestly he made it more convoluted than it needed to be. I actually prefer by this Axe I Rule more than Phoenix on the Sword, but I love both of them. But in doing so, By This Axe I Rule became the very first Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword, and that is reviewed on paperbackwarrior.com. I recently read it, reviewed it. It's out there for you to enjoy. It did receive a publication in Weird Tales 1932, Phoenix and the Sword. Anyhow, this King Kull paperback is just awesome. It's a must-have for any fan of really action-adventure in general, but of course sword and sorcery as well. You can buy copies of the paperback through any used book retailer. There's also a new omnibus collection created by various publishers that also includes these Kull stories. I think Del Rey has one, or two, actually. There's also two short stories that the King Kull paperback doesn't include that do feature Kull, but one of them is another character stories, Cormac McArt story, and the other just mentions Kull in passing. I don't think either of these two short stories are what anyone would consider a Kull short story. It's just mentioning Kull, basically. So those two stories have been omitted from this King Kull paperback, rightfully so. Last, the stories in this paperback are different than Conan in that Kull is written as a more philosophical king. He has absolutely no interest in sex or love, any romantic relationship. He's just not into that. He's more of the thinking man's king. He's sympathetic to women's rights, but he doesn't have a girlfriend or wife or queen or anything like that. This makes the character a stark contrast to, Conan's quest to just get laid every place he ventures, which is fine, but they're just totally different characters. Other than these Kull stories, the character appears in comics and the rather dreadful 1997 movie starring Kevin Sorbo, who played Hercules on TV. Kull has starred in 3 separate Marvel comic series titles from 1971 through 1985. He also appears in Savage Sword of Conan sporadically. There was a 1989 graphic novel called Kull, The Veil of Shadow. According to Wikipedia, in 2006, Dark Horse Comics bought the rights to use Kull. Their first series, which was titled Kull, is based on the Shadow Kingdom story. As of 2012, there's been 3 miniseries published, Kull, the Hate Witch, and Kull, the Cat in the Skull. Dark Horse also republished the Marvel stories into 2 different Kull collections. The Marvel color comics were collected into 5 volumes titled The Chronicles of Kull, and the Marvel magazine format black and white stories collected into 2 volumes titled The Savage Sword of Kull. Additional reprints were published in Robert E. Howard's Savage Sword. In 2017, IDW Publishing got the license and began publishing Kull Eternal, using the story The Mirrors of Tizun Thun as the foundation of that series, and it also puts Kull into a modern setting. And other than that, that is it. That's the complete Kull rundown. You have everything that you really need to tackle Kull, the character, but honestly, the King Kull paperback is really all you need. But I want to credit the Complete Weird Tales Omnibus, edited by Finn J.D. John, as a source material for this feature. Also, the omnibus Kull, Exile of Atlantis by Tantor Media, narrated by Todd McLaren. I listened to that one. Also, the Conan fandom page, Wikipedia, the blog Barbarian Keep, and my good friend and H.P. Lovecraft historian, Mr. Greg Watson. I'm going to bring on Tom now to do his book review for this episode, and you probably need to hear someone besides me talk anyway, right? So here comes Tom to do his book review for the week.
All right, so my review this week is for a paperback from 1962 called Kim by Robert Colby. Robert Colby is one of my favorite authors of the paperback original era. Kim was a 1962 hard-boiled private eye mystery that was really packaged inappropriately as a sex novel by Monarch Books. It's still available today from, I think, both Wildside Press and Prologue Press as ebooks and maybe even a paperback, so you should have no trouble getting your hands on it. The narrator is Miami private eye Rod Stryker, whose practice involves helping wealthy clients with personal problems. His latest client's an old lady by the name of Aunt Martha, who's concerned about her 22-year-old niece, Kim. She's engaged to a nice boy, but she had a fling with a local strip club pimp named Eddie Torino, who runs a sex-for-pay boat between Miami and the Bahamas. Torino wants Kim on board as his personal escort and is threatening her fiancé and Aunt Martha with physical harm if Kim doesn't comply. Aunt Martha basically wants Stryker to drag Torino into a dark alley and beat him until he begs for mercy and promises to stay away from Kim. Stryker, however, has other ideas how to handle it. He goes and visits Torino to talk with him, and then the plot unfolds from there. Kim is a super hot chick, as you can imagine. Stryker has a partner at his PI agency named Myra, and she's one of my favorite things in the book. She's this beautiful 29-year-old ex-cop from Los Angeles, and everybody who reads this book is going to fall in love with this character, Myra. They're occasionally romantically involved, although the relationship's mostly business. Later in the novel, he does an interesting first-person narration switch from Stryker to Myra. I normally don't like that, but it actually worked this way because they're both such good characters. Basically, the whole mystery evolves into who is pulling the strings behind this manipulation of Kim. There are some sex scenes along the way, and they're pretty hot in a 1962 kind of way. This is just a first-class hard-boiled mystery with two great lead characters. There are some pacing problems, I thought, in the second half, but it has a real twisty conclusion that everyone's going to like. This one's just another winner. I want to recommend another book that's come out. Robert Colby book, The Devil's Collector, has finally been reissued. And back in the, I think it was the 60s, Colby wrote a bunch of short stories called the Paint the Town series. Paint the Town Red, Paint the Town Blue, Paint the Town Green. And they've all of which stars a private investigator who kind of works like a vigilante in many ways. He's a freelance operator who solves murders and stuff like that. And there's a bit of a vendetta around him. Anyway, they call the book is The Devil's Collector, and it compiles all of these Robert Colby Paint the Town short stories from Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine together, including a new one called Paint the Town Aquamarine. You should check it out. It's available on Amazon. It's called The Devil's Collector by Robert Colby. I have a copy, and I'm looking forward to reading it and reviewing it. For Tom at Paperback Warrior, that's my book review of the week, signing off.
And this concludes another episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. I want to say thanks to the Windy City Pulp and Paper Convention for allowing us to be on a panel at their show. They were just really nice. They were supportive. And they're doing great things for readers, fans, and collectors. You can check out paperbackwarrior.com each weekday morning for a brand new book or story review, and you can enjoy hundreds and hundreds of archive reviews right there on the blog. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes, and I want you to visit us on social media often. We're constantly posting throughout the day, archive reviews, just open-ended questions and things like that, so feel free to participate, become engaged. In the meantime, I'm going to quote Tom and say, "Be cool, everybody." And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.